we the Pew Center, have as well convened dialogues in the past, and one of those is the Climate Dialogue at Peconico. For those of you who haven't seen it, we have copies of the report of the Peconico Dialogue out at our booth. We brought together 25 people, senior policymakers and stakeholders from 15 countries. These were people from government, from business, from civil society, include government people from many of the key countries, both developed and developing, and in terms of companies who were there, we had quite a few sectors represented: Alcoa, BP, DuPont, Exelon, and Eskom, which are utilities in the U.S. and South Africa, Rio Tinto, and Toyota. And the group reached a consensus on a broad vision of a post-2012 framework. So I think the key conclusion to emerge from this dialogue is that we must engage all the major economies in the post-2012 effort, and the key to doing that is through a more flexible international framework, in the sense of a framework that allows countries to take on different types of commitments. Kyoto-type targets will make sense for some countries, but not for all. And for those others, we need to think about other forms of commitment that can deliver action without necessarily binding them to a quantitative target. So what are some of those other possibilities? The report suggests a couple. One is the possibility of sectoral agreements, where you have governments agree on measures, whether they're targets or standards or some other form of measure, to address emissions from a specific sector. Perhaps an energy-intensive industry, perhaps the electric power sector, perhaps the transportation sector. So that's one potential element of this flexible framework, sectoral agreements. Another is what we call policy-based commitments. And here the idea is that developing countries could come forward and commit to implementing national policies that will help reduce their emissions or their emissions growth. Other potential elements of the framework, different forms of technology cooperation, and quite necessarily some measures to address adaptation. But another key point that came out of the Peconico dialogue is that we can't simply have countries pursuing these different types of efforts on an ad hoc basis. You need to bring them together within a common framework and allow them to negotiate and trade off against one another. Because if we're all just left to our own devices, we're not likely to achieve the highest level of effort. In order for any one country to deliver its highest level of effort, it will need confidence that its counterparts, who often are its competitors, are also delivering their fair share. So you need a framework within which these different national efforts are linked and negotiated as a package. And in the view of the participants of the Peconico dialogue, the natural venue for doing that is, in fact, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change.
The Secretary General has taken a leadership role in climate change. He's identified it as one of his chief priorities. And during the CSD this past May, he appointed 3 special envoys to help him consult with countries on the issue. And then following that, he decided he was considering different ways he could contribute and actually support the upcoming negotiations, and he decided to hold this high-level event on climate change. Adaptation is a key concern for all countries. Developing countries, which face the greatest threat, are also the least able to cope with the adverse impacts of climate change. And recent works by the World Bank and the Stern Review and others suggest that the cost of adaptation are substantial, and estimates vary quite widely. But it is clear that existing financial resources do not meet the needs. Increased funding will be needed and can be made available through the Adaptation Fund and other like mechanisms. And they should be operational as quickly as possible. The parties have signaled that the adaptation will be a key building block of a future agreement. Technology is another key building block of any future agreement. It is also one area that unites the interests of industrializing and developing countries. Accelerating deployment is a critical challenge. We do not have the luxury of decades to innovate, deploy, and commercialize clean technologies. On the one hand, we must go into the clean technology of tomorrow, but on the other, we need to focus on overcoming barriers, technical barriers, economic barriers, and policy barriers to ensure that technologies of today are rapidly deployed. The carbon markets, and in particular the clean development mechanism, have opened substantial investment flows into developing countries. Some analyses suggest that as much as $100 billion over the coming decades. The bulk of CDM, or Carbon Development Mechanism, investment has gone to a few large developing countries, and several UN system agencies are working to build capacity in countries in neglected regions, such as Africa, to attract investment. Many observers regard that an expanded CDM is a key element in a post-2012 agreement. We have 2 years of intensive negotiations ahead of us. The Secretary General has publicly and privately encouraged parties to conclude negotiations by 2009. If the prior negotiations set the stage, we are well into the main act. At the same time, expectations of progress must be tempered by the reality that the issues and interests facing the negotiators are extremely complex.
So one of the reasons why it's very difficult to move the United States forward on this is basically the